Wonderful. I think we will get started today. Um, Thanks again for coming to the talk today. We're really sorry about the change in sort of digital venue that ended up happening due to some scheduling conflicts with another event. But we really appreciate having you here regardless. So today we'll invite Dylan Connor from Arizona State University to talk about some results on sequences of demographic and economic change. Dylan is an assistant professor at the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State University. He completed his PhD in geography at UCLA in 2017, and then was a research associate at the Institute of Behavioral Science at the University of Colorado Boulder. Dylan uses big historical data to study core issues relating to immigration, demography, intergenerational inequality, and urban and regional development. So with that, I appreciate everybody here has their mics muted. So let's turn the floor over to Dylan. Oh, and one last thing, please put your questions in the chat of the Zoom call so that we have questions to discuss at the end of the talk. Thanks, and now really over to Dylan.
Appreciate it, Levi, and thanks to you and Rachel for inviting me to come and speak to this group. I actually really appreciate the turnout as well, given the last minute technical change. Just a quick check, can you hear me okay? The audio is good, brilliant. I'm happy to take questions along the way if there's specific things that people want to stop me on or take questions at the end. What I'm going to present today is ongoing work, so it's a great time for feedback. So I'd really appreciate any input or thoughts that anybody has, and I'm just going to dive right in. So I don't think I've met most of you, so I just wanted to take a just to double check that did that slide transition happen?
Yes, it did. You're good to go.
Brilliant. Okay, so I don't think I've met most of you. So I just wanted to take a quick second just to kind of introduce myself, say a little bit about the types of things that I've been working on, and then actually just talk about a recent study a little bit that I think helps ground what I'm going to talk about today. So in a recent, so what I work on generally is the long run evolution of places using big historical data to understand how basically place level changes affect important social and economic outcomes and processes. So in a recent paper that Michael Storper and I published in PNAS, we were grappling with the issue of the changing geography of social mobility in the United States. And in this paper, what we were looking at is how the effect that a place has on the life chances of children born into poverty, how those place effects have changed over time. So effectively looking at the evolving landscape of intergenerational social mobility or intergenerational opportunity over time, and then trying to understand, what it is about those places that might lead them to deliver opportunity in one period and maybe not in another, and how this landscape effectively evolves over time. And so what we arrived at in that paper was this, not only did we describe, how the landscape has changed over time, but we also came to a point where we found that effectively this changing geographical structure of opportunity seems to effectively be shaped by two dimensions. One, which we refer to as deep roots. And by deep roots, we mean things that are rooted in long run interactions between populations. You can think about things like racial segregation, particularly in the US South, ethnic diversity, effectively things that shape local social, political, and kind of cultural institutions. So on the one hand, you have those kind of more sociological processes, and then the other force affecting social mobility tends to be things related to the changing economic structure or the changing economic fortunes of places, as we refer to it. So in addition to pointing out these two kind of mechanisms of change, the kind of quick findings of what we came to was, on the one hand, and those kind of more sociological processes seem to have become more important over time in the US in shaping intergenerational outcomes. And actually the effect of urbanness as a determinant of social mobility also appears to have weakened over time. Which is, so to rephrase that last point a little bit, and it's important here, in the early 20th century, growing up in a city was a really, really important factor in whether somebody born into poverty could move out of poverty. But actually today, that's not true to nearly the same extent. So ruralness actually seems to have come to play an important role relative to urbanness as a determinant of social mobility. And I'll dig more into that in just a little bit. So in this talk, that's to give a little bit of a backdrop of the types of things that we've been working on. In this talk in particular, what I'm going to focus on are the changes that have been unfolding in small town America over more recent decades. So this project is coming out of a bigger project with my grad students at ASU and my collaborators at CU Boulder, in which we're focused on recent trends and transitions in small town America. Small town America is quite interesting because although a lot of us have this image of small town America being a kind of a relatively homogeneous white place, I think the scholarship in this area is increasingly showing that rural America is dynamic and it's diverse, but it is very coarsely studied. And I'm going to push forward a little bit in that direction here. And what I'm going to do in this talk is effectively look at some of the dominant changes that have been unfolding in small town America from roughly 1980 up to the present day, and then look at how those trajectories of change across places relate to things like social mobility. So just to put some of this a bit more in kind of popular context, I think a lot of us would be familiar with a lot of the narratives coming around that come out in the media around how small places in the US have effectively been left behind or have struggled over time. You can see these headlines about America's forgotten towns, or why small town America is kind of losing its struggle with the contemporary economy. And I think that this is the dominant view that people tend to hold when they're thinking through a lot of these issues. So just to pull out a couple of examples. So this is going to be a place that I return to later on in the talk. On the one hand, this is a quote from an editorial in the Washington Post titled "Despair and Debt in Small Town America," and a resident was actually writing in, and they were saying, sure, there are drugs, people drink far too much, but we also have very high unemployment, and things weren't always this way. And they go on to explain effectively that the people in this city, Rogers City, and in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, are really facing really difficult kind of structural issues. And I think that this kind of image of deindustrialization is again linked to that kind of that image of struggle in small town America that many of us hold. But what's also interesting is that when you dig a little deeper, you actually start to see these kind of more diverse stories. So this was an article from the Atlantic a few years ago on Orange City in Iowa. And effectively their catchline was, this is the small town where the American dream lives on. And they kind of tell a story about this small place that actually seems to be doing okay. It's got a local college. It seems to be relatively young. There's employment, and people are doing quite well. So you end up actually with this kind of what starts to emerge is this kind of more nuanced picture of actually some parts of small town America are doing actually quite well, even if we have this bigger picture of a lot of difficulty and struggle. Just to quickly touch back on that issue of social mobility, which I touched on earlier on. This is just a couple of statistics. Here there's a measure of upward social mobility across all urban places as they're designated in 1980 and rural places as they're designated in 1980. And this number is actually the income rank that children born into poverty attain effectively as adults. A higher number means that they climb higher on the income ladder as adults. This is based on their childhood location. And what you can see immediately, and this actually comes out of a lot of the work that Raj Chetty has done, and it's evident in his maps when you look at it, that actually on average, being born in a rural place seems to be associated with higher rates of upward social mobility than being born in an urban place, which I think is totally contrary to what a lot of people would, and I myself would have imagined at the outset. Rural places have lower incarceration rates, and actually by the 2018 ACS, they actually seem to have higher rates or higher levels of income inequality. So there's actually, you know, rural Americas, it seems to be much more complicated than I think a lot of people will give it credit for. So in this talk, the two questions that I'm really grappling with here is one, to ask how the economic and demographic changes of recent decades have unfolded across small places in the United States. And then to ask, well, what are the implications of these place level changes for important individual or personal level outcomes, let's say like social mobility or interpersonal income inequality. And that's what I'm going to grapple with here. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about actually the data set that we had to build to kind of start to push on this, because there's actually a couple of constraints in trying to study small places straight out of the gate. So much of the prior work on rural America and how we define rural places is actually based on county level definitions, which rely on what are referred to as RUC codes, or rural urban continuum codes. And the RUC codes effectively run, you know, it's basically a 9 to 10 class scheme. The number actually varies decade to decade, but effectively runs from 0, which is big metro areas with a lot of people, all the way down to, you know, rural places with less than 2,500 people, and which are either adjacent or not adjacent to metro areas. The issue here now is that counties in the US can actually be quite large. So there's roughly 3,000 counties in the US. And we all know, of course, we can all think, I think, of places that we would consider to be rural that might actually be quite proximate to urban areas. And indeed, actually more urban places that tend to be in more remote places. So there's a lot of reasons to think that this county definition is not necessarily getting us everything we want. So let me just talk through that quickly in an example. This is Maricopa County, Phoenix, Arizona. I think Levi and Rachel are well familiar with Phoenix. So this is what you can see here is from our HISTAC data. You can see the urban footprint of Phoenix. And this is actually Maricopa County. And so what you can see with Maricopa County is that while you have a lot of the area of the Phoenix city covered by Maricopa County, you also have this much more sparsely settled regions of the county to the west and to the southwest. And now by those urban-rural continuum codes that I spoke about a moment ago, this entire area would be classified as urban. Yet if you drive out here, you know there's a lot of smaller settlements and more remote places. And these are the types of places that we want to be able to include in our analysis. So our first step to try and deal with this was to actually start to dig into, first of all, shift away from counties and push toward what are referred to in the US as census designated places, which is a kind of a sub-county geographical unit that are supposed to be in some way, have some kind of internal coherence and be recognizable as places. And what my colleague Johannes Ohl, he's a postdoc at CU Boulder, has been working on is actually trying to come up with a way of classifying these places at the sub-county scale in terms of their urbanness or ruralness. And so he's devised this index, which effectively just uses measures of total population and then proximity to other places to come up with an index that ranges from 0 to 1 effectively. And so it focuses on both, it takes into account effectively the total population of the place and then its distance to other places of different sizes. So this is a kind of a separate project that we've been working on, but which has been very useful here. We've come up with a threshold for roughly what seems to be an acceptable cut for defining rural places or distinguishing rural from urban places. And we end up in our sample with about 8,000 places that we consider to be some mix of rural and remote. And we've built on top of that a longitudinal data set where we can track these places using the decennial census from 1980 to 2010, and then using the American Community Survey and the 5-year estimates up to 2018. So we have this longitudinal place level data set running from 1980 to 2018, in which we're particularly focused on rural places. So just to give a quick snapshot, this is our Maricopa County. When we overlay our rural index, these blue areas are now considered to be, to make it into our rural sample, basically, through some mix of either their own, the population size of the settlements in those places, or their distance from Phoenix itself. Just a quick snapshot, these are the county RUC codes, colored according to their red being urban and blue down to rural. You can see that they're quite strong in the way that they impose urban and rural, or quite coarse in the way that they impose urban and rural in the US. And this is a mapping of our rurality index, which is the blue areas are places that end up getting classified as rural in our sample. And you can see that it's a much finer aggregation. If you look in the Southwest, for example, with the county RUC codes, this entire region is effectively urban, but with our place level index, you can see actually some places we can start to distinguish between urbanness and ruralness in that region. So it's a big improvement, it seems, in terms of distinguishing between urbanness and ruralness. Okay, so that's how we effectively cut out our population of places that we're going to study from 80 to 2018. And what we're really interested in on the first level is trying to actually measure and capture the dominant changes that are unfolding across places over this period. And we're particularly interested in demographic and economic changes across that roughly 4 decades. So I think we immediately recognized that the changes that we were trying to capture were multivariate in nature, right? We're interested in things like, if we're interested in the kind of difficulties or perhaps kind of more optimistic stories of change, we're interested not only in economic characteristics like incomes or poverty rates, but then also things like demographic change related to total population or age structure. And so once we started to recognize that this place level change stuff that we're getting into is multivariate in nature, we realized that a lot of the kind of standard regression techniques, for example, that we would use kind of fall short in actually trying to back some of that out. So after quite a bit of searching, and we actually tried several different approaches at trying to classify, multivariate change in places over time. And we tried trajectory analysis, for example. There's a whole lot of methods based around that. And ultimately, actually, where we landed is on this method of sequence analysis, which I think is originally imported into the social science from genomic research. It was picked up by the sociologists a couple of decades ago in particular. And actually, it's having a real resurgence in geography at the moment. And I think actually earlier I saw Elizabeth on the call, and I think actually Elizabeth's work was really influential actually in when we first saw her papers and we started to think about what could we actually do with it. There's a whole set of papers in which we saw this approach put to really good use to study neighborhood change. And since then, actually, there's been a whole proliferation of other papers in this area, and I think actually it's fair to say, and I'm happy to talk about this a little bit later on. There's some very good examples applying sequence analysis to geographic data, but there's actually quite a lot of rougher examples, and I think that there's good scope to actually be a little bit more careful in how we kind of execute these analyses. So one of these problems is that when you fit, so effectively the way the sequence analysis works is and I'll talk through exactly the steps in just a moment, but it's effectively a 2-stage clustering procedure where you take a bunch of variables on a place, you generate effectively a set of clusters or a typology for those places, and then you track in the second stage of clustering how places are moving across those types over time. And one of the issues with this approach is that when you use a lot of variables to generate these places, you actually end up with these very specific and in some senses overfitted clusters. And this was a real problem for us, because when we started to work on this, we started to put in lots of variables into our analysis. And then we ended up with these very particular clusters, and we were finding amazing levels of stability. So we kind of had to dial things back a little bit. It didn't really seem to make sense in terms of what we knew about rural places. And what we started to do was, on the one hand, refine the variables that we were focused on. We limited our analysis to a couple of demographic variables: total population, age structure, a couple of economic variables, median income, the poverty rate, and the Gini coefficient. And we actually started to explore this multi-channel sequence analysis approach, which effectively, instead of having let's say a typology of places, and you're looking at how places move through this typology or these types over time, the multi-channel approach actually allows you to define multiple sets of clusters and sequences, so sequences in multiple domains. And so what effectively we do is we define an economic channel and we define a demographic channel, and then we look at how places move over time across those two channels. And that seemed to provide much more intuitive results for what we were trying to do here. And that allowed us to actually identify a set of, I think, intriguing kind of dominant trajectories of change, which I'll talk through in just a second. Just to give a little bit of the intuition of this here, I'm not going to spend too much time on these first stage clusters, but effectively what we do is we take these attributes and we take the places from 80 to 2018, we stack them on top of each other. Then we cluster on those variables. We end up with 4 economic clusters that seem to characterize places, right, effectively incorporating things like low poverty, high income places, all the way up to high poverty, low income places. And then in terms of these demographic clusters, what you get are a set of place characterizations involving things like, small places with very old populations, larger places with high proportion of working age adults, and optimally we end up with something like 6 to 7 demographic clusters, 4 economic clusters. And then effectively what we want to do is we want to see how places are moving across these different clusters over time. That's effectively what the sequencing approach sets out to do. So just to return actually to that example from earlier on, this is Orange City, Iowa. That was that place in Iowa, that was the place that was covered in the Atlantic, where actually things seem to be going okay. And it was kind of like a counter narrative to small town America in the article. And actually we came to this example after we did the analysis. So it's one of those cases where we dug into the data after the fact to see actually, well, is our approach working the way we think it should? And, is the journalist right? Is the data right? So we tried to do a quick comparison. And so let me just talk through this for a second. So you've got, on this first column, you have the year of observation. So it's 1980 here down to 2018. You have the population cluster that Orange City falls into, and then the economic cluster that Orange City falls into. And what you can see actually is remarkable stability. You can see that in the population cluster, Orange City has a large, high working age proportion population all the way through from 1980 through to 2018. And actually on the economic cluster, you see something very similar. You see low poverties, and I say high income, but I mean high income relative to other small places. You see Orange City to be a low poverty, high income place all the way through the full sequence of the data. So this is clearly a case of, at least in relative terms, prosperity and high levels of stability. If I jump over to that other example, Rogers City in Michigan, which was the subject of this editorial, where it was a much more, a case that seemed to be much more in tune with the narrative of, the negative effects of deindustrialization, and a place that was being left behind. Actually, you see a lot more movement across these clusters. So if you start in 1980, on the population side, actually it starts in exactly the same population cluster as Orange City did. It's large, it's got a high working age proportion. By 1990, it's got a medium-sized population, it's young, and then by 2000 and throughout the rest of the sequence, it's got a medium-sized population and it's relatively old. On the economic side, you see, again, starts in the same cluster as Orange City, low poverty, high incomes. In 1990, it actually jumps into this medium poverty, medium income class. In 2000, it drops back down again into low poverty. 2010, back up into medium poverty, and 2018 up into the high poverty category. And there's a real acceleration of poverty between 2010 and 2018 in Rogers City. So this is a very different case of place level change, and one that's also, I think, quite consistent with the narrative for this place and for that region of the country. So effectively what we're doing then is we're taking these transitions and then we're trying to back out a set of common sequences or trajectories of change across the full period of the data. And so what we end up with once we start to apply that multi-channel sequencing approach, we end up with effectively 6 dominant sequences of change that seem to characterize small places across the US. And I'm going to talk through a couple of those just to give you an example of what's coming out of there. And just to give a quick outline of what the intuition is here in the analysis. So effectively what we're focused on here on the one hand is describing these sequences and just characterizing the changes over time. So describing those sequences, then looking at the baseline factors that are actually associated with membership in those sequences. So remember at the beginning, or at the beginning of the methods, I said, okay, we focus on these specific population and economic attributes to do the sequencing. But there's a whole array of other attributes, factors related to race and ethnicity, economic structure, other attributes that might be influential in shaping where those trajectories go. So in the paper, we use a multinomial logit to predict membership. Here, I'm just going to talk through descriptive statistics to make it a bit easier. And then we actually want to look at the effect of these sequences potentially on important personal outcomes to see if there's actually any potential knock-on effect of these place level changes on personal differences. So descriptively, we've been mapping out these sequences, just trying to get a sense of averages over time. I'm not going to strain your eyes too much and talk through these lines individually. I'm just going to summarize what we find, but happy to return and talk through the specific sequences. These sequences these lines not only pull out some of the broader trends, but also show quite a lot of variation in different places across our 6 sequences of interest. So effectively, what we come up with in terms of our 6 dominant sequences, on the one hand, we have large high-income places that have older age profiles and aging age profiles. We have a sequence that is larger places, and by large, I'm roughly talking around like 1,500 people on average, as opposed to 600 people on average in the smaller places. So large, high-poverty places with young age profiles. Sequence 3 and 4 are particularly interesting here. These are places 3. It's kind of a mid-sized set of places which seem to experience a kind of a post-2000 rise and decline in poverty. And what this looks like is places that were hit potentially hard by the 08 recession, but actually seem to rebound in some sense. There's another set of places that are growing in population size, but post-2000 just have a steady increase in poverty. It's really striking. 5 smaller places that are aging, and then 6 are these kind of mid-sized places that have high levels of income, actually quite like sequence 1 up here, but also seem to be aging at a higher rate. So I'm just going to talk a little bit through these 4 sequences, just to give a sense of what we're seeing and how these patterns are playing out, before turning to actually some of the potential implications of these sequences of change over time. Actually, just before I do that, one of the kind of just interesting side facts is you actually see in terms of, so this is just a percentage of the share of places in that sequence that are in the same baseline clusters in 1980 and 2018. So this is a measure of how stable that place is. And you actually see quite a degree of change and stability across these places. So for example, 1 and these larger mid-sized places with higher incomes actually seem to exhibit quite a lot of stability, 14 to 17% across the 80 to 2018 period. But actually, if you look at this place, number 4, for example, which is growing in population and is experiencing rising poverty, only 2% of places in that sequence are in the same clusters in 80 and 2018. So you do see big differences in change in stability across these different sequences. Okay, I'll leave that for now. Okay, so let's just dig a little bit into a couple of these sequences. I'm just going to actually step through sequence by sequence and show you where these places are popping up, where they're popping up, what their attributes are, and what we kind of know about them. So this is, these are the first sequence. I'm going to start with sequence 6, actually, which is the mid-sized places, high average incomes relative to other small places, and they also seem to be aging. And actually, one thing that I want to point out before we get too far into this, so I just want to emphasize that actually these sequences, and this is actually one of the things that really struck us as a result, these sequences contain no explicit spatial information. So it's a totally aspatial method on our side. It's the sequence approach effectively takes the attributes of places and then clusters along them. So we find it particularly striking that you actually see very strong spatial patterns in these sequences, because there's no, statistical magic where we're trying to, cluster proximate places or something like that. The patterns that jump out are true to the data, which are aspatial in the way we put them in. So our first sequence that we go through are these places that seem to be kind of mid-population size, reasonably high levels of income, and they're kind of aging over time. And what you can see is that these places are really kind of heavily clustered in the kind of upper Midwest, to some extent, in the kind of northern mountain regions, and in the plains. So in terms of being mid-sized population, they, roughly 1,000 people on average per place, low levels of poverty and relatively high incomes. And so what I'm going to do here is, just as I step through each case, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the kind of economic and social context of those places, to try and get a sense of actually broadly what these places are like and how they might matter for other social and economic issues that we might be interested in beyond the place level changes themselves. So what I have here is just, it's fairly straightforward, a set of attributes, economic attributes in the first column, excuse me, and a set of economic attributes here, and then a set of socio-demographic attributes down here. So we're thinking about these effectively as being related to the economic structure of these places, and then something to do with the social context or deep roots of these places. And then we have non-rural places. So those are places actually outside of the sample. And then we have the averages for each of our sequences. So you don't need to dig too much into the table, but I will just scroll through the highlights so you can get a sense of what's happening here. So these mid-sized high income places, they effectively, what seems to make them distinguishing in many senses based on their baseline characteristics is that they've got one of the highest college degree holder proportions in the US, around 11% in 1980, 11% of the population hold a college degree. Their share of their non-white population share is extremely low, and is actually the lowest of all other categories. So these are very white places. So these are kind of white, relatively highly educated places. And in terms of single parent households, they have very low levels of single parent households. So this is kind of a, an image of a, kind of very cohesive household structure, or white college degree holding, low levels of single parent households. And remember that case of Orange City, which I spoke about earlier, hang on just one second. So Orange City earlier on, that place that seemed to be doing relatively well relative to other small places, is bang in the middle of this set of clusters here. And we've been experimenting a little bit with the maps. One of the issues is that the spatial structure of places across the US is very uneven. You get very different levels of density. So we've had to work a little bit to try and bring out some of these patterns. But you can see that Orange City is effectively bang in the middle of this red area right here. So the second sequence that I'm going to focus on here is the large, high poverty, young places. These places actually, poverty is actually worsening in these places, and actually population growth seems to be going up over time. And what's really striking about this sequence is the degree to which it's concentrated in the south of the country and you know, effectively across the Sun Belt. But the south in particular, I think, really stands out as being the you know, as being the kind of dominant region in terms of this trajectory of large and high poverty places. Populations are large, inequality is high, as I said, and incomes are relatively low. In terms of the other attributes of these places, what's quite striking is that I think, well, the most obvious and most striking point that jumps out of this is that these places are by far and away the most, have the highest non-white population shares across all of our sequences. So you can see if on average, 30% of the people in these places are characterized as non-white. They have relatively high Native American shares, high Hispanic shares, and high rates of single parent households. And in addition to that, they also seem to have a relatively high concentration of manufacturing. So this is this sequence effectively of this is a sequence of persistent high racialized poverty across the full 80 to 2018 period. Sequence one is actually quite like the first sequence I spoke to, but actually these places tend to be larger on average. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but these places are larger on average, they have higher incomes, and they tend to have relatively high age profile, or relatively old age profiles throughout the full sequence of the data. What's also interesting in terms of the kind of other attributes of these places, they tend to be, you know, of all sequences, they're the most agricultural. They're also very white, not quite to the level of sequence 6, but far and away compared to many of the other sequences. And they're actually not that particularly distinct along any of these other attributes. So it seems to be really a case of kind of larger kind of agricultural settlements, particularly in 1980, and very white at baseline. And so the last sequence that I want to talk through is this sequence of effectively, it's a case of growing in population and a really sharp rise in poverty post-2000. And I think this actually, I think in terms of dynamics and change might be actually the most striking of the 6 that we have. These are medium-sized places. They actually seem to be becoming younger, but they have this really sharp increase in poverty in 2000, and then particularly from 2010. And what you can see is they're really concentrated in a lot of these regions that have experienced you know, quite a lot of deindustrialization. So you have that region in northern Michigan, in other parts of the Frost Belt, and then also in proximity to on the periphery of the Californian cities and in the Southwest. So you see a really strong kind of spatialization of these patterns over time, and one I think that's quite intuitive. In terms of what we see in the other attributes, as you might have guessed, these regions actually have a relatively high specialization in manufacturing in 1980. They have the lowest share of college degree holders across the full set of data, and they're actually very white as well. So this is actually really the kind of, I think, really actually true to that kind of powerful image we have of these regions of, you know, deindustrializing places in more remote regions of the US, and which were heavily dependent on industry in the past. And actually that comes out quite strongly in both the population and the economic profiles that we see unfolding here. And just to kind of touch back on Rogers City, that place that I talked a little bit about at the beginning of the talk, the fun fact about Rogers City is that it has the largest limestone quarry in the world. And I think it has the largest limestone processing plant in the world. And Rogers City is this little red spot here, and falls right into this category, and is really true to what we're seeing in the sequences. So to just roll it on a little bit, I just want to say a little bit about the kind of next step of, so we have these descriptive sequences, we kind of have a profile of what these places look like and what their trajectories of change are over time. And then I guess the question then is, well, so what? Is this just a descriptive exercise? Or are we just trying to capture these changes computationally over time, or is there actually something more to it? And so what we're doing now is we're actually looking at the potential effect of these place level trajectories on important life chances. So effectively examining whether these place level changes actually matter for people, as it were. So so what we've got here is I'm just gonna show 3 outcomes. We have been looking at a bunch of attributes. So we have upward social mobility. I extracted this from the Raj-Chetty data at the place scale. There's now a great tract level data set of upward social mobility across the US. That's where that upward social mobility measure comes from. We've the Gini coefficient in 2018, and then we actually have a measure of incarceration, which also comes from the Chetty data. And then we're effectively predicting the average levels of these outcomes across our 6 sequences relative to that very first sequence that I started with, which is mid-sized places, high average incomes, and an aging age profile. So this is actually the model with no control. So let me just move forward. So in addition to looking at how these sequences relate to these outcomes, what we're also doing is controlling for a whole bunch of baseline characteristics, from the economic attributes of the place to its racial and ethnic composition, to its urbanness, even to its region of the country. And the idea here is that what we're trying to get at is that the actual sequence itself has implications for these outcomes. It's not just a function of some baseline attributes predicting these sequences. So these are quite tightly controlled models. You can pick out a couple of interesting things straight away. So the first is that once we actually adjust for all of these attributes, we don't see any difference in incarceration across these different sequences. There are differences in the baseline attributes. Incarceration is higher in the South, for example, but once we start to adjust for differences across regions and populations, the incarceration effects go to 0. But where I want to focus just before turning this around is actually on these upward social mobility measures, and start to look at which places seem to be performing better or worse in terms of delivering opportunity for kids born into poverty. So this upward social mobility measure is the average income rank, average adult income rank of children born into poverty in the national income distribution. And this is standardized. So these numbers are effectively a standard deviation move in this outcome. So let me just talk through a couple of the results. So sequence 2, that was that large, high poverty, young cluster, heavily concentrated in the South, very high non-white population shares. And what you can see is that upward social mobility relative to other places is far lower. So this is like almost, let's say, approaching half a standard deviation lower. Being in this sequence, net of these other attributes, upward social mobility is half a standard deviation lower in places falling into sequence 2, relative to that kind of mid-sized, high-income sequence, those places that were clustered in a lot of the northern plains and northern mountain region. You can also see that the Gini coefficient is much higher in these places as well. So this sequence of change is associated with very low social mobility and high rates of income inequality. What you see for sequence 3 and 4, these were somewhat similar places, except that the distinguishing characteristics seem to be mainly how they responded post-2000 or post-recession. You can see social mobility is lower in these regions, but is particularly lower in the regions of the country that have had the largest rise in poverty. Sequence 5, small and aging, I won't talk about it too much, but also has lower rates of social mobility. And so effectively what we're seeing then are quite large differences in upward social mobility across these regions based on this membership in these different sequences after controlling for a whole range of attributes. So just to start to round back and say a little bit about what we're seeing. So in terms of summarizing the findings, what we're seeing are very strong prevailing trends on the average across small town America. But we're also noting that small town America really has many, many faces in terms of the types of changes that we're seeing unfolding across places. We're seeing very persistent poverty in some places, very persistent racialized poverty in some places, and then more optimistic economic changes in others. So there's quite a spectrum of change across these places. These trajectories have a very strong footprint. They're definitely racialized, and they're linked to baseline economic conditions and location. And really what we're starting to push toward in this paper is really to say that, you know, this is not just about changing places, but what we're showing in the analysis, particularly in the social mobility analysis, is that these changes in places also seem to have a serious effect in shaping the life chances of people. So that's where we're at. Really appreciate any questions, and I appreciate you sticking with me and listening. And we're totally open for feedback along the way. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, Dylan. That is an excellent presentation. We have a couple of questions or comments in the chat, which I think I'll work from the most recent upwards from this point forward, and maybe anybody else who has questions, please do just pop them in the chat at this time. So starting off with a question from Liz Delmel, a previous SAD speaker. She says, awesome presentation, Dylan. She was wondering how much the whole sequence that you analyze impacts the social mobility outcomes. She questions sort of, what if you had done the regression just on the conditions of the place in the last decade, for example?
Thanks for that, Elizabeth. That's actually a great question, and not something that we had really thought about. So actually, maybe if you could clarify. So are you thinking that what we might want to do is adjust for the fact that a place could be in a particular cluster, and then try to kind of estimate the effect of the sequence itself, the movement across the clusters? Am I picking you up right?
While we're waiting for her to respond, possibly written, or if she's around, could unmute. So how about we ask David's question and then move to a couple others. So David asks, what was the motivation for starting in 1980 versus an earlier time period? He wonders how much the starting point of 1980, coming right after the 1970s economic crisis and right before the farm crisis of the early 80s, impacts places' trajectories. So sort of, is there a starting effect, do you think?
Yeah, so thanks for that, Dave. So the primary motivation was actually was the classic actually data constraints. So it was a fair bit of work to try to, actually assemble the kind of longitudinal data. And 1980 is kind of where we had reasonable boundaries that we could kind of do that. And actually the kind of next step of the project is that we're actually working, we've RDC access to actually push the sequence back to 1930, which would be amazing if we can put this together. So we'd have a sequence of places from 30 through to 2018. But I totally take your question about the kind of baseline conditions. And that actually is one of the interesting points on the sequence analysis approach that I think people really need to think about, is that actually the very first cluster that you start in has a really strong effect on actually where that sequence can potentially go. So it's a really strong, it's a really strong separating factor in the data. in terms of the economic crisis of the 70s and 80s, I think that's something we'll definitely have to think about. I don't have a crisp answer for the effect of that because we haven't looked super closely at it, but we can definitely incorporate it. But certainly the baseline conditions of the place do play a really formative role in where the place actually gets sorted in the sequence.
Great answer. I have a question related to that, but maybe we'll get there after we hit a couple of other questions. So I think Elizabeth has a response now. I'll read it for the recording just so that it's there. Liz clarifies that she was trying to get at, instead of using the whole sequence as an explanatory variable, what if you used just one point in time? In other words, does it matter how the place evolved long term, or does it mostly matter how things are now?
Yeah, that's a great suggestion, and that's something we've taken into account. What we have done is we adjusted for how things were in 1980, but we haven't said, okay, well, maybe it's just the contemporaneous characteristics that matter. So that's a great suggestion. We'll definitely incorporate that.
Killer. Rachel has a question.
Just to pick up on what Elizabeth just said, though, I could see that depending on how long people have been in a particular place, you might also hypothesize that some junctures are more important for outcomes than other junctures of the life course, which of course would be pulling in other threads that we've seen on like neighborhood effects, for example, but also I'm thinking about like the immigrant earnings debate that there was in economics about sort of at what point you had to immigrate where it was going to have an effect on what earnings would be as an adult, right? So that would be sort of interesting, depending on what kind of longitudinal data you have for people, and then your sort of longitudinal approach to places. You could take the whole sequence and suppose that the sequence matters for outcomes, which I think is important. Or, as Elizabeth says, the initial point might matter for outcome, or one particular point in time might have a determining effect on an outcome. But you might also want to match the age of the person somehow to the time and place, right? Because it's the intersection of the two. It's, were you 16 or 18 or 22 and just out of college in, say, 1977, in which case, you know, your outcome is permanently affected forever simply because of the age you were in that particular time period. So good old-fashioned demography. But that wasn't my question. My question was thinking about outcomes for people and thinking about whether urban versus rural, or what kind of trajectory a place has gone through. This is sort of a half-baked question, but if I were a reviewer in a particular sort of more demographic journal, a question I would have would be, how much of this is sorting over time? So places change over time, sort of the economic structures. I think also what it means to be rural changes over time. And so those effects aren't constant. But the kinds of people who are living in these sorts of places are also changing over time. And so when we observe, when we observe that, say, 40 years ago, you could grow up in a particular kind of place, and this is the outcome you could expect. Part of that is a function of the place, but part of it is a function of the kind of person who was living in those places back then. And so I'm thinking somehow it'd be really nice to sort of match people, be able to sort out the effect of place, I guess is what I'm saying. Like if you hold the individual characteristics and maybe family characteristics constant, is the effect that we're measuring actually due to the place or the trajectory of change, and not something about just this sorting of population that's taken place over time? Because at every spatial scale, we've seen a lot of change in the distribution of different subgroups in the US. So super fantastic. I've seen other stuff that you've done, so I have no fear that you're able to think about all of these things, or probably already have thought about some of them. But those are the things that sort of lit up in my head as you were talking. And I really, really appreciate the talk. This was excellent.
And that's, I think that question is actually kind of one of those, it's a technical question on the one hand that a reviewer could definitely bring up, but it's actually kind of like a philosophical question in some way, which is like, you know, if you take the slowdown of migration in the US, for example, a lot of people are saying, oh, you know, it's like unmotivated people in these communities who don't want to move to cities. And, you know, this is the kind of, you know, narrative that you get on that side. But then the issue is like, well, people's aspirations and motivations and whatever don't appear out of a vacuum, right? It's like their contexts affect many different things about their lives and how they grow up. And I guess as geographers, we have this like difficult thing where we're trying to like get at both of those in some way, right?
Well, I've been thinking, yeah, and I don't want to hog the time because I think there's at least one other question. I can see the chat lighting up, but I've been thinking a lot about a paper that is by Maria Abreu and Özge Öner that was looking at the Brexit vote and sort of all of the initial discussion about the Brexit vote that was about places left behind and how places were voting a particular way. And so they tried to sort out the compositional effects from the geographic effects. So it's, I mean, topically, it probably isn't a paper that is necessarily in your line of work, but they do a nice job of trying to match people. And so analytically, it's interesting, but I like the work, as you just said, that is sort of conceptually and analytically paired. Those are my favorite kinds of questions. And so it's just something to think about. And you would certainly have the capacity to be able to answer that sort of question.
It seems fundamentally related to concerns about separating cohort from place in understandings of age period cohort kind of models. So there might also be some work by like Andy Ballop at Sheffield, who might have interesting things about that when it comes to geographical analysis of time series and separating place from people effect. So we actually have exhausted the chat's listed questions. I do want to mention that David also posted a relevant NPR, the Indicator podcast, if people want to check that out in the chat. It's back up in the scroll. And speaking of the kind of founding effects versus where the trajectory goes, I wondered if you had any thoughts about the difference between the sort of alignment cost and substitution cost that we use to calibrate these kinds of sequence analysis models. Because that's a parameter that you can specify, and that's not generally estimated. So you could have analyses where time becomes more or less important as a tuning parameter. Have you looked at anything like that, where you're sort of looking at common experiences regardless of time?
In terms of the substitution side of it, I think our biggest concern was to make sure that as you'd expect, that the ordering matters, right? Because there's a lot of different algorithms for estimating these sequences. And a lot of them, you see, so let's say a sequence goes A, B, A, B, right? Or let's say A, A, B, B, right? And then you have another sequence, which is B, B, A, A. Some of those algorithms will consider those to be quite similar, and others will consider them to be quite different, right? And so I think our main concern was that, a place that's rising in poverty, for example, over time, is distinguished quite separately from a place that's declining in poverty over time, right? So it's the temporal ordering, I think, that we really wanted to get at. We haven't dug too deeply. So are you thinking about trade-offs between?
Yeah, so in the kind of the optimal matching kind of sequence algorithms, right? Which is generally, I think that's what Liz uses. That's what a couple other papers in this space use. You can slide a sequence around to find the best subset and then use the substitution class to model how distant those two sequences are. But you're only ever matching, well, often on a subset of the string. And as your string gets longer, as you increase your temporal analysis to 1930, you might be matching on more common and common subsets. So my question is sort of, does it matter when I experience that decline? In your work, it strongly does, but have you thought about this ability to sort of say, these were declining places and these were declining places, but this place declined in 1970 and this place declined post-2000?
Right, yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, and it's not something that we've dealt with too much, but it also goes directly to Rachel's question about the kind of age at which these cohorts come through, enter the labor market, for example, right? So in that case, the period effect is going to be super important. So we're going to really care about when those transitions happen in time, but definitely as we start to shift to 30, I think that's a really good question. We're going to have to definitely deal with that much more seriously.
Sure, yeah. And it's, I think, a challenge for the literature as well on sequence analysis, because I think, as you say, there's a lot of people doing this kind of thing. But some of these more finicky points about sort of the estimation versus specification of those costs might need to kind of be thought about in a more formal way. So Not seeing any other questions in the chat, and given that we already are kind of over time, I might suggest that we call it a day here. And then if I can, our next week's presentation will be hopefully in the standard kind of Zoom webinar that we're all used to. But it will importantly be at 4 p.m. local time in the UK, which will happen under daylight savings time now. So be sure to check your clocks on the correct time. It'll be the 4 p.m. London. And at that time, we'll have Martin Fleischman, who's a research associate at the University of Liverpool, talking about some of his research on spatial signatures, looking at dynamic classifications of the built environment in cities around the UK. So thanks again, everybody who attended today. I hope to have the talk posted to YouTube within a couple of days. And yeah, hope we see you next week. Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dylan. Thank you,
much.
everyone, for the crazy situation this week.
Appreciate it all. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.